to From the Mind of Christine McConnell. So in this episode, we are tackling something I've been talking about doing for a while, and that is creating my own wallpaper to be printed. It kind of intimidated me, if I'm being honest, because I didn't know how to create a repeating pattern that needed to be like printed. I've done it on walls by painting it, but that doesn't quite need to be as precise as this does. So I've played around on the computer, and I think I'm just basically trying to demystify this process for you. And it really isn't as challenging as I initially thought. So we're going to just start this episode by mocking up in the computer something called a half drop repeat. And I'm just gonna it's a silly thing, it's not a final thing at all. I'm just gonna show you how this process is done. And then from there, we're gonna actually start designing and drawing what our pieces are gonna look like. This is going to be broken up into a two-part episode because there is a lot to cover. So with that said, let's begin. I'm going to be mocking this up in Photoshop, and so I'm creating a file that's 27 inches wide by 45 inches tall, after which point I'm going to increase the size of the canvas so I can focus on my pieces over this white section and still be able to sort of move them off to the side while still being able to see them. At the urging of some patrons, I got this apparatus called a Cintiq, and you can actually draw directly onto the screen. And so that's what I'm doing here. I've kind of been having a lot of fun with it. What I'm creating right now are just silly little decorative pieces that I can sort of show you how you create a repeat. So these are kind of silly, but I'm still kind of a persnickety person, so I'm trying to make them as nice as possible. I tend to find that it's really beneficial to create a bunch of extra little pieces, so that's what I've done here. So that way, when I start sort of orchestrating this, I have lots of little things to pull from to fill in any blank spaces. I also find the best way to create a really symmetrical looking kind of decorative piece is to draw just half of it, duplicate that layer, and flip it horizontally. And that way you can just scooch it over, and when they lock up, they look really uniform and visually appealing. So now I'm going to create something called a half drop repeat by putting a few of these pieces over here on the right-hand side. And because I want these, when you actually put these pattern pieces together, you want them to sort of shift as you set them. So anything that's sitting off into the brown now needs to be cut off and put over here on the left-hand side, but at a lower position. Then we're going to take those extra pieces there on the bottom and raise them up above that to fill in that gap. So this way, when those pieces start floating next to each other, they sort of click in. Now for the center, we're going to take one of these decorative pieces and put half of it here on the bottom and take that lower portion and move it up to the top. So when the pattern repeats, it just kind of seamlessly transitions and keeps going. I should also tell you, this takes some tweaking. You can sort of get these pieces into the position that you think you want them. And then once you start doing that repeat, you might find that something on one side needs to be adjusted sort of just a tiny little bit. So the transition or the places where they lock up are perfect. So don't give yourself a hard time. This is just kind of a tedious process to do. In preparation for this episode, I watched a whole bunch of videos on YouTube trying to understand how to create this half drop repeat. So I'm learning, as I go along with you. So my objective with this episode is to teach you how to do this in a way that I would have understood it on a first viewing. So I'm hoping it's having that effect. Here's where you can see that when you move one of these pattern pieces over, it's lining up in the middle of the adjacent piece. And what this ultimately accomplishes is it kind of scatters the pattern so it doesn't look quite so uniform, and it gives it a slightly more organic, less repetitive look. And now just for fun, I'm gonna kind of tweak the colors a little bit so you can get a sense of the options of how this could ultimately look. Okay, so now that we have kind of an understanding of how a half drop repeat works, now let's start looking for inspiration. I ordered a bunch of books that feature antique prints, and I'm just going to kind of leaf through them and see if I can't find something that sort of inspires me for what I'm going to do in this room. This was such a fun process to do because while I was leafing through these, one of the things that I actually stumbled upon was something similar to that border pattern that we discovered, the 1800s one, up on the top of the room. So it was a really sort of educational adventure on that front. And then also I just found several things that I thought looked fantastic, and I might actually take some heavy inspiration from when I start doing a frieze in the room. So now that I've looked through those books and I have a few kind of pieces of inspiration, I'm actually going to go into the room and take some photos of actual architectural elements that are here that are original to the room. And I'm going to use those as kind of inspiration in how I design this. Now, if you find yourself in a house that doesn't maybe have, it's not as old as this, doesn't have as many of those elements, you really kind of have the freedom creatively to do whatever you like. But here, because I'm lucky enough to have these pieces here, if I incorporate those into the paper, it's just going to make the whole room really cohesive. So let's start doing that process. The funny thing about doing this particular part of the process was I started to discover little decorative elements in places where I hadn't even sort of noticed them before. So you might actually want to do this in your house because there might be some sort of artistic embellishment that you've just never really even noticed before. Now that I've got my inspiration, I'm actually going to start just drawing out physically some of the individual pieces that I'm going to ultimately want to incorporate. So the reason that I'm physically drawing all of these pieces out as opposed to doing them just in the computer is there's a texture you get when working with pencils and graphite that's really difficult to mimic in the computer. Now, with that being said, I love the digital medium just as much as I like the physical. So if you are a digital artist, obviously play to your strengths. But for this room, I kind of want this paper to look as old-fashioned as possible. So that is the reason I'm using this method. This is something you'll probably enjoy. Remember in the computer where I was drawing out half of the decorative piece and then duplicating it and flipping it over? A way you can do that in the real world is to grab yourself some trace paper and a graphite pencil that kind of is a little bit messy. Lay the trace paper over your design and trace obviously what you've drawn underneath. And then when you flip that trace paper over to where you want it to lay, take the pencil and everywhere that you marked, just mark again, and what that will do is kind of leave a shadow of what you've drawn. To give this piece a little bit more depth, I'm going to take a pencil and just sort of draw a line on the inner, part of the design. And then I'll actually be adding some shadow lines to this. And then that I will ultimately achieve is something that looks kind of a little bit more three-dimensional. You'll see me duplicating a lot of my work in this episode using this trace paper method, just because it is so much simpler than, kind of reinventing the wheel. Once you've drawn something, you don't have to keep redrawing it, and this sort of simplifies that process. I'm now going to recreate that medallion shape that's on the ceiling of the room. And I'm doing this again by only drawing one corner, and then I'll be doing that trace paper method to just duplicate that around 4 more times. It's looking pretty close, and now I'm going to add a few decorative embellishments. So now that I've got pieces of inspiration from this book, from the actual room itself, I want to incorporate, something kind of unusual. I love the story by Jules Verne, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, and I want to kind of incorporate a little bit of the elements from that story into this paper and design. It's not going to be too in your face, but it is going to be subtle enough that you do kind of feel it when you walk into the room. So that hopefully will put my own twist on this project. Whenever I draw out something artistic, I do these really light strokes with a pencil to kind of like find the shape with my hand. And so nothing looks good at first. And then once it's kind of taken on the silhouette that I'm happy with, then you can start, going in harder with the pencil and erasing those practice lines. Shading with graphite is also really fun because you just lightly make some pencil marks, rub it in with your fingers to create a shadow, and then use an eraser to sort of make any highlights or diminish any of those values. Oh, and the term values when you're referring to art means the lights and the darks. Now, to give this a really old-timey illustrative look, I'm using a ruler and I'm just drawing hard pencil lines anywhere there is a shadow. And what I'm ultimately trying to achieve is to make it look like this whole thing was drawn just using a hatching technique. And I'm sure many people know this, but many may not, is a hatching technique when it comes to art is using kind of fine little lines. And so when you hear someone say cross hatching, what they mean is those lines are laying over each other and they're just kind of creating a shadow area. And on a lighter note, I don't know what this circle drawing McDoodad's name is. I just know that it works. And so whenever I share sort of funny little technical information, what it mostly means is I've recently learned it and I think it's interesting. So I always try to share those things with you because there certainly was a point where I didn't know what they were called or what they did. Those two first pieces that I drew out were inspired by elements that were in the room, but this particular little kind of porthole that I'm drawing is just kind of something from my imagination that I'm trying to create that I feel like will add my own kind of signature to this paper. And finally, I'm adding that beveled effect, so this kind of is cohesive with those other pieces that I drew. So something that's really fun about this is I don't draw and sketch too much. So every single time that I do it, I find that I get a little bit better. Now, obviously, I'm far away from being the best out there, but I kind of find that if you are ever competing with anyone, that should always be with yourself, because if you're always challenging yourself and trying to get better, that's the only person you should be sort of like focusing on. Because what I've personally found by following this rule is I'm continuously getting better. So it's just kind of something that whenever you do something like this, look back at your previous work and see if it's starting to slowly improve over time. So now, just for fun, let's watch this process sped up. I'm so happy with how this came out, and now I'm going to sketch just one more in a different position. Now that I've got some of these principal pieces made, I'm going to sketch out basically just some filler pieces. I may or may not use these, I don't know, but you just kind of want to create them so you have them in your back pocket. Now I'm going to try my hand at a cute little jellyfish. And once more, let's watch this process sped up. Now I'm just going to draw kind of a background pattern that I may or may not use. We'll see how it looks when I start putting all of these pieces together in Photoshop. But in the meantime, it's just kind of a fun way to practice. What I've done here is created a grid of, I think it's about 3 inches tall by 1.5 inches wide. And then I'm just creating a diamond pattern following those points in the corners. It's now time to scan all of these pieces into the computer. I'm scanning them in at about 600 DPI, which is double the size they'd need to be to print, just because I want them to be as sharp as possible. And then once I've done this, I'm going to cut out anything that isn't the actual design. And in the following episode coming up, I'm going to actually start weaving these together, giving them the textures they're ultimately going to have, and giving them the color schemes that they're going to be printed with. Okay, so this is where we're going to cut this episode off. This next part, I don't want to rush because it really needs to be as beautiful as possible, because this is going to be hopefully in this room for a really long time. And then I'm also going to be making these patterns available for people to purchase. So I want them to be as incredible as I possibly can achieve. So with that said, I can't wait for you guys to see what's coming up. So take care of yourselves, and I'll see you again very soon.